She was just a desperate young woman looking for work. He was a grieving millionaire who trusted no one. But when Nora Bennett knelt before his silent, wheelchair-bound daughter, Clara looked up and smiled for the first time in years. Ethan Hawthorne's life would never be the same, though he didn't know why, yet. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. The taxi's tires crunched over the gravel driveway, the sound swallowed by the vast, cold air surrounding Hawthorne Manor. Nora Bennett leaned forward in the back seat, her palms damp despite the chill. The estate stretched out before her, pale stone walls, black wrought iron balconies, and windows so tall they seemed more like watchful eyes than glass. Even from here, it looked like a place where warmth had been locked away years ago. She clutched her worn leather satchel closer, feeling the outline of the small wooden box inside. Her rent was overdue, her fridge at home nearly empty. The job interview today wasn't just another opportunity, it was survival. But it was also a step into a world she didn't belong to, one of marble floors and sharp edges where mistakes weren't forgiven. The driver stopped at the foot of the stone steps. "Here you are," he muttered, glancing at the towering doors as if they, too, were judging him. Nora paid with exact change, her fingers trembling as she stepped out. The air was crisp, but it carried no scent of flowers or cut grass, only the faint tang of rain-soaked stone. She climbed the steps, each one feeling heavier than the last, until she stood before a pair of doors carved with intricate patterns. A brass knocker gleamed in the muted light. She hesitated, catching her reflection in the polished surface. A young woman with loose hair pulled into a low knot, her navy coat a shade too faded to pass. Before she could lift the knocker, the door opened soundlessly. A tall woman, in a tailored black dress, stood there, her gray hair pulled into a severe bun. "Miss Bennett?" "Yes," Nora said, her voice quiet but steady. "Come in." The woman's tone left no room for pleasantries. She stepped aside, and Nora entered into a foyer so vast it seemed to hum with its own echo. Marble tiles in black and white stretched out in geometric perfection, and a crystal chandelier hung overhead, catching the dim light like frozen rain. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Kincaid, the housekeeper. "Mr. Hawthorne is occupied at the moment. You meet Clara first. Follow me." Nora's footsteps clicked against the floor as they passed through wide hallways lined with oil paintings. The eyes of long-dead Hawthornes seemed to track her, their expressions cold and unyielding. No photographs, no evidence of laughter, just history and silence. They stopped at a half-open door. The room beyond was bathed in muted sunlight from a tall window. Near it sat a small figure in a wheelchair, her back to them, a book resting unopened on her lap. "Clara," Mrs. Kincaid said softly, "this is Miss Bennett." The child didn't move, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. Nora stepped forward, her eyes taking in the frail shoulders beneath the pale cardigan, the way the girl's dark hair hung in a neat curtain. She had the stillness of someone who had learned not to expect much from those who approached her. "Clerically, hello Clara," Nora said, gently, crouching a little so her voice came from somewhere closer to the girl's ear. No answer. From the corner of her vision, Nora noticed movement, a tall figure standing in the hallway's shadow. Ethan Hawthorne. She'd seen his face in business magazines, dark hair streaked with silver, sharp jawline, a gaze that could cut through glass. Now, in person, he looked carved from the same cold stone as the house. His arms were folded, his expression unreadable. Nora realized he was watching not just her, but the space between her and Clara, measuring it, weighing it. Most people, she suspected, would try to fill that silence with chatter or coaxing. But she remembered something from years ago, back when she worked with children who had learned to retreat from the world. Sometimes words were just noise. Instead, she set her satchel on the floor and pulled out the small wooden box. The hinges creaked softly as she opened it to reveal a collection of tiny, handmade wind chimes. Thin threads of silver, glass beads, and seashells gleamed under the pale light. Without asking permission, she eased herself down to sit cross-legged on the rug near Clara's chair. She held up one of the chimes, letting it dangle so the beads caught the sunlight streaming in. A faint, delicate sound filled the air, not loud but clear like the whisper of a memory. She swayed it gently, tilting it so the colored light danced across Clara's hands where they rested in her lap. Slowly the girl's fingers twitched, as if catching the glow. In the hallway, Ethan's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Nora didn't speak, didn't push. She just let the light move, a silent invitation. Then, like a hesitant flower turning toward the sun, Clara lifted her chin. Her eyes, wide, dark, and startlingly curious, met Nora's. It was a fraction of a second, but it was enough to see the change. The guarded stillness cracked, and a small, shy smile curved Clara's lips. From the shadows, Ethan's gaze hardened. Not with anger, but with something unreadable, caught between disbelief and something else he hadn't felt in a long time. He said nothing, but his arms slowly unfolded. Mrs. Kincaid glanced between them, her brows knitting, as if unsure she'd seen what she thought she had. But Nora knew. Moments like this didn't happen by chance. She set the chime in Clara's hands, letting the girl feel its shape. "It's yours," she whispered. Clara's fingers curled around it as if afraid it might disappear. And somewhere behind them, Ethan Hawthorne took a slow breath. The first sign that maybe, just maybe, something in this cold house had shifted. For a moment, no one spoke. The faint tinkling of the wind chime seemed to linger in the air long after Nora's hand let go. Clara's gaze didn't waver. She studied the beads and shells as though they were pieces of a secret only she could understand. Mrs. Kincaid cleared her throat. "Clara, perhaps you should—" Nora shook her head gently. "It's all right." Her voice was calm, almost conspiratorial, as though she and Clara were the only two in the room. The little girl's fingers traced one of the shells, her small hands pale against the smooth white surface. "It sounds like the ocean," she said softly. Mrs. Kincaid's eyes widened, not at the words themselves, but at the fact they'd been spoken at all. From his post in the doorway, Ethan straightened slightly, his gaze fixed on his daughter. Nora caught the subtle shift in his expression, but she didn't look at him for long. This wasn't about him. "That's exactly where I found it," Nora said, leaning closer so her voice was just above a whisper. "On a beach where the wind always sings." Clara tilted her head, her dark hair sliding over her shoulder. "You went there?" "Once," Nora replied. "When I was your age, I collected shells like this. My mother said the wind put stories inside them." Clara held the chime to her ear, closing her eyes. "I think I can hear one." A small smile touched Nora's lips, but she didn't push for more. She simply let the silence work for them. Finally, Mrs. Kincaid spoke again, her voice cautious. "Miss Bennett, perhaps Mr. Hawthorne would like to speak with you now." Only then did Nora turn her attention toward the tall figure in the shadows. Ethan stepped into the light, his measured movements betraying nothing of what he might be thinking. Up close, his presence was even more formidable, not just because of his height or the sharpness of his features, but because of the way he carried himself, as if every inch of him was a barrier meant to keep the world at bay. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "this is not a typical household. If you're here expecting to change things, you will be disappointed." Nora met his gaze without flinching. "I'm here to take care of Clara." The way she said it, not as a job description but as a promise, made something flicker behind his eyes. He didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he gestured toward the hallway. "Let's talk." Mrs. Kincaid stayed with Clara as Nora followed Ethan through the corridors. The silence between them was thick, punctuated only by the distant ticking of an antique clock. They entered a study lined with bookshelves. Dark leather chairs faced a low table, and tall windows overlooked the gardens, their glass streaked with the fading drizzle from earlier. Ethan gestured for her to sit. "You've worked with children before," he said, taking the seat opposite hers. "Yes," she replied. "Rehabilitation?" Nora hesitated, then nodded once. "For a while." "You left that field?" "Yes." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press, at least not yet. "Daughter," Ethan began, leaning back in his chair, "is not like other children. She has a condition she was born with. She will never walk. Nora felt the firmness in his voice, the finality of it, as though the words had been rehearsed for years. Has anyone told her that? He studied her, his brow tightening. It's reality. It's one interpretation of reality, Nora said quietly. Something in his jaw tightened. I don't tolerate false hope in this house, Miss Bennett. My daughter has already been through enough. Nora said, her voice steady. She smiled today. The words landed between them like a small, deliberate challenge. For a long moment, Ethan didn't reply. His gaze drifted toward the window, where the wet garden gleamed under the muted afternoon light. Finally, he rose. Mrs. Kincaid will show you to your room. You'll begin tomorrow, 7 o'clock sharp. It wasn't approval, not exactly, but it wasn't rejection either. Nora stood. Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. He didn't answer, already turning back toward his desk. Mrs. Kincaid appeared as if summoned by some invisible bell and led Nora upstairs. The guest room was pristine, with a view of the same garden Ethan had just stared at. A single vase of white lilies sat on the desk, their fragrance delicate but cool. When the door closed, Nora leaned against it, exhaling slowly. She'd made it past the first threshold, but something told her the real work had only just begun. Ethan lingered in the study longer than he needed to. He told himself he was simply reviewing tomorrow's schedule, but his mind kept returning to the moment in the sitting room. The way Clara had looked up, the light catching her eyes, the tiny smile that had seemed impossible for so long. He'd seen therapists, teachers, and nannies come and go, each promising something different, each leaving without making a dent in Clara's silence. He didn't know what made this woman any different, and yet, he had seen it. In her room, Nora unpacked the rest of the wind chimes from her satchel. She hung one near the window, letting it sway faintly in the draft. The soft chime filled the air, and she wondered how long it would take before Clara asked to hear another story from inside the shelves. What she didn't see, what she couldn't, was Ethan passing by the garden window below, pausing when the faint sound reached his ears. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the overgrown hedges and untended flower beds, before turning away with a look that was almost but not quite curious. Upstairs, Nora touched the chime gently, as though sealing a quiet promise to the little girl she'd just met. Tomorrow, she thought, they'd begin again. The next morning began before the first light touched the tall windows of Hawthorne Manor. Nora woke to the faint echo of footsteps in the hallway and the distant sound of a clock chiming 6 times. She dressed quickly in a soft cream sweater and dark trousers, tying her hair back with a plain ribbon. This wasn't the kind of house where you appeared. When she entered the kitchen, Mrs. Kincaid was already at the long counter, placing a tray of neatly cut toast and a glass of orange juice. Clara's breakfast, she said without looking up. 7 o'clock in the conservatory. You'll find her ready for you. Nora nodded, taking the tray. Good morning. Mrs. Kincaid didn't return the greeting, only added, Mr. Hawthorne expects the day to run exactly as outlined in the schedule. She gestured toward a laminated sheet on the counter. Nora glanced at it. Every hour of Clara's day was accounted for. Breakfast, occupational therapy, reading time, lunch, speech therapy, supervised play, rest. Not a minute left unplanned. There was no mention of the garden, no room for spontaneous games or storytelling. Carrying the tray, she found Clara waiting in the conservatory, the pale morning light falling across her face. The girl's eyes brightened slightly when she saw Nora, though her hands remained folded in her lap. Morning, Clara, Nora said warmly, setting the tray down on the small table beside her wheelchair. Did you sleep well? Clara gave a small shrug. It was quiet. Nora poured the juice into a glass, watching as Clara took a piece of toast. I like quiet sometimes, she said, but sometimes I like mornings with a little music. Clara tilted her head. Music? Nora smiled. We'll see about that later. At precisely 8, a tall man in a white coat appeared in the doorway. Ready for therapy, Clara? His tone was polite but brisk, as if he'd been through the motions 100 times. Nora followed them to the therapy room, where bright mats covered the floor and specialized equipment lined the walls. The therapist, Mr. Lane, guided Clara through a series of upper body stretches and arm exercises. He didn't once suggest she try to stand or shift her legs, and Clara didn't attempt it. When Nora asked about leg movement, Mr. Lane shook his head. Her condition is permanent. We focus on comfort and maintaining what mobility she has. It was the same tone Ethan had used the day before. Firm, final, without room for argument. By late morning, Nora had begun to understand the unspoken rules of the house. The staff moved efficiently but without warmth. Meals were served on time, the schedule was honored, down to the minute, and anything beyond that, laughter, mess, unpredictability, simply didn't fit. When lunchtime ended, Clara was escorted to the library for reading hour. Nora joined her, selecting a book from the shelves. Clara flipped through the pages without much interest. "Do you like stories?" Nora asked. Clara said quietly. "But not the ones here. They're boring." Nora glanced at the shelves, all neatly arranged with classics, reference books, and the occasional collection of poetry. Nothing whimsical, nothing that spoke to a child's imagination. "You might have some better ones," Nora said, "but we'd have to make them up ourselves." Clara looked skeptical. "Make them up?" "It's who lives in a big cold castle. She has a secret." Clara leaned forward just slightly. "What kind of secret?" "She can fly, but only when no one's looking." The smallest smile touched Clara's lips. "That's silly." "Exactly," Nora said, "and that's why it's fun." They didn't notice Ethan in the hallway, pausing at the door. He leaned one shoulder against the frame, unseen by either of them, listening as Clara's quiet voice began to grow more animated. When Nora suggested they act out part of the story, Clara hesitated. "I can't walk." "We don't need to walk," Nora said easily. "We can use our arms, our faces, our voices." Clara agreed, and soon they were pretending to be birds in disguise, flapping their arms and laughing softly at each other's dramatic expressions. Nora noticed the flush of color in the girl's cheeks, the way her posture straightened ever so slightly. From the hallway, Ethan's brow furrowed. He told himself it was because the schedule was being ignored, yet he didn't move to stop it. By the end of the day, Clara had spoken more words to Nora than she had to anyone in months. The second morning, Nora arrived in the conservatory to find Clara already waiting with the wind chime in her lap. She was tilting it back and forth, watching the colored light flicker over her hands. "Good morning," Clara said without prompting. Nora's heart lifted. "Good morning to you too. Ready for breakfast?" They ate together, and when therapy time arrived, Nora accompanied her again. This time, as Mr. Lane began the stretches, Nora crouched beside Clara. "Let's try something different," she said softly. Mr. Lane gave her a look. "We have a set routine?" "I'm not changing the routine," Nora said, "just adding to it." She picked up a small rubber ball from a basket in the corner. "We'll play a game while we stretch. Every time you throw this to me, you lift your arm just a little higher." Clara grinned faintly and tossed the ball. They played for several minutes, her movements growing freer without her even realizing it. Mr. Lane didn't stop them, though he muttered something under his breath about non-standard methods. By mid-due noon, Nora had found other ways to slip warmth into the rigid structure. She brought out paints and a roll of thick paper, setting them up on the kitchen table during Clara's. "We're supposed to read," Clara said, glancing toward the doorway. "Reading's good," Nora replied, dipping a brush into a swirl of blue. "But today, we're going to read colors instead." Clara's curiosity won out. She dipped her brush in yellow, dragging the bristles across the paper. Soon they were mixing shades, laughing when their colors bled together into strange greens and purples. That laugh, light and unguarded, carried into the hallway, where Ethan happened to be passing. He slowed his steps, the sound pulling at something in him he couldn't quite name. He stepped closer to the doorway, unseen, and watched as Clara painted a rough sun in the corner of the page, her face lit from within. It had been so long since he'd heard that sound from her that he almost didn't recognize it. That evening at dinner, Clara was chattier than usual, describing the color reading to Mrs. Kincaid, who merely raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Ethan listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When Clara reached for her glass, Nora noticed how he subtly pushed it closer to her. It was the smallest gesture, but it told her he wasn't as distant as he pretended to be. On the third day, Nora introduced a new game. She placed a scarf on the floor just out of Clara's reach. "If you want it, you have to lean forward a little," she said. Clara frowned. "That's cheating." "It's a challenge," Nora corrected, smiling. Clara hesitated, then leaned forward, stretching her arm until her fingers brushed the fabric. "Got it," she said, holding it up like a prize. From the hallway, Ethan turned away before they could see him. His chest tightened with something unfamiliar. Pride, perhaps, or fear that this newfound spark might not last. By the end of the week, Nora could see the difference. Clara's laughter came more easily, her sentences were longer, and she greeted Nora each morning without prompting. The house itself seemed to feel it, the way light pooled a little warmer in the conservatory, the way the echo of footsteps no longer seemed so hollow. Still, the schedule remained, and the staff kept their distance, treating these moments as harmless diversions that would eventually fade. And Nora knew better. She had seen the first cracks in the walls that had been built around Clara's world, and she intended to keep widening them. One story, one game, one smile at a time. The rain had lifted overnight, leaving the world washed clean. Early sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the conservatory, painting soft gold over the marble floor. Nora stood behind Clara's wheelchair, her hands resting lightly on the handles. "Where are we going?" Clara asked, eyeing the closed double doors that led deeper into the house. "Somewhere I think you'll like," Nora replied, "but you have to promise not to tell anyone until we're back." Clara's lips curved into a half-smile. "A secret?" "Frankly." "Exactly," Nora said, pushing the chair forward. They moved quietly down a corridor Nora had noticed the day before, one that seemed less used than the others. The carpet was faded, the air cooler here, and at the end was a pair of heavy glass doors clouded with dust. Through them, Nora could see the outline of tangled greenery. She eased the door open with a low groan of hinges. The scent hit her first, damp earth, wildflowers gone to seed, the faint sweetness of overripe berries. The back garden was unlike the manicured lawns at the front of the manor. Here, nature had reclaimed what had once been planned. Hedges bulged into the paths, roses climbed in untidy spires over wrought iron arches, and grass pushed up between the stone. Clara's eyes widened. "It's huge." "Was the last time you came out here?" The girl shook her head. "I don't remember. Maybe when I was little. Before..." She trailed off, her hands tightening on the arms of her chair. Nora didn't push. She simply steered them forward onto the stone path. Birds chattered overhead, and somewhere nearby, water trickled faintly, perhaps from an old fountain. They reached a low tree, whose branches swept almost to the ground. Nora pulled a handful of bright scarves from her satchel, silk in colors of cobalt, crimson, gold, and green. Clara tilted her head. "What are those?" "You'll see." Nora tied the first scarf to a branch, letting it flutter in the breeze. The sunlight caught the fabric, making it glow. She tied another higher, just beyond where Clara could reach without leaning forward. Soon, the tree looked like it was blooming with colors, the rooms flickering like flags. Clara said, smiling. "Exactly," Nora said. "And they're yours to collect. But there's one rule. You have to try to reach each one yourself." Clara looked doubtful. "Even the high ones?" "You don't have to stand. Just lean, stretch. See what you can do." Clara took a breath and reached for the nearest scarf. Her fingers brushed the edge, and she laughed, a bright, surprised sound. She tried again, this time gripping the silk and pulling it free. "This one," Nora said. "Now the blue one." The blue scarf was tied just far enough that Clara had to push her body forward in the chair. She stretched, giggling, as the breeze tugged it away from her fingertips. After 3 tries, she caught it. "This is fun," Clara said, cheeks flushed. They moved slowly from tree to tree, Nora guiding the wheelchair, Clara leaning and reaching. Each success brought another scarf draped across her lap, a growing collection of color. Nora watched her closely. noting the way her back straightened, the way she began to shift her weight without prompting. This wasn't therapy as the schedule defined it. This was movement wrapped in play, the kind that didn't feel like work. Halfway through the garden, Nora heard footsteps behind them, firm and unhurried. She turned and saw Ethan Hawthorne striding toward them, his dark coat brushing his knees. His expression was sharp, and Nora's heart sank. She knew that look. Ethan stopped a few paces away, his gaze sweeping over the scene, the scarves fluttering in the branches, the bright colors spilling across Clara's lap, the wheelchair positioned on uneven garden stones. His jaw tightened. What is going on here? His voice was low, but there was an edge to it. Clara looked up, startled, but Nora didn't flinch. "We're collecting treasures," she said calmly, "and working on Clara's reach and balance while we're at it." "But this isn't on her schedule," Ethan said. "The therapist isn't here right now," Nora interrupted gently. "And sometimes progress doesn't happen between four walls." For a moment, she thought he might order her back inside. But then he noticed Clara leaning toward a branch, her fingers stretching for a yellow scarf just out of reach. Her laughter rang out as she finally caught it, holding it up in triumph. Ethan's mouth opened, perhaps to remind Nora of the rules, but the words didn't come. He was watching Clara too closely, his eyes narrowing, not in disapproval, but in something that looked dangerously like wonder. "Did you see, Daddy?" Clara said breathlessly. "I got it without help." Nora glanced at him, waiting. Ethan said finally, "I saw." There was a pause, and then he stepped back. "Don't stay out too long." Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the house. Clara watched him go, then looked at Nora. He didn't yell. "Maybe he liked what he saw," Nora said, tying the last scarf to Clara's wrist like a ribbon. They spent another half hour in the garden before heading back inside, the bundle of scarves piled on Clara's lap. By the time they returned to the conservatory, the girl's cheeks were still flushed with excitement. That evening, Nora passed Ethan in the hallway. He didn't stop her, but his gaze lingered for a beat longer than usual, as if he were trying to read something on her face. Later that night, in his study, Ethan sat at his desk with a folder open before him. His assistant, Mark, stood by the door. "You asked me to look into Miss Bennett's background," Mark said. "She worked in pediatric rehabilitation for nearly 6 years. Very good reputation. Left suddenly about a year ago." Mark hesitated. The official record says she resigned. Off the record, she'd been treating a boy, 9 years old, who was injured in a car accident. Severe injuries. He died during her care. No fault of hers, according to the hospital report, but she blamed herself. Ethan finished quietly. Mark nodded. After that, she stopped working in clinical settings. Ethan closed the folder slowly. He sat back in his chair, his mind replaying the image from earlier that day. Clara leaning forward, laughing in the sunlight, clutching that yellow scarf like it was the rarest thing in the world. For years, he'd told himself he was protecting her by keeping her within the boundaries of the schedule, by avoiding anything that might lead to disappointment. But now, he wondered if he'd been protecting himself instead. He glanced toward the darkened hallway that led to the conservatory. Somewhere down there, he imagined Clara, sleeping with those scarves still near her, vivid against the pale quilt. And somewhere beyond that thought, he pictured Nora, the woman who had walked into his house and, without asking permission, started changing everything. The invitation came without warning. It was late afternoon, and Nora was helping Clara arrange the bundle of scarves from the garden into a small wooden box. Each one had been carefully folded, the colors peeking out like secret treasures. Clara was humming softly under her breath when Mrs. Kincaid entered the conservatory. "Miss Bennett," she said, her expression as unreadable as ever. "Mr. Hawthorne has asked that you join him and Clara for dinner this evening, 7 o'clock, in the formal dining room." Nora looked up in surprise. Dinner? With both of them? Mrs. Kincaid's tone suggested she didn't know why either. "You may wish to dress accordingly." When the housekeeper left, Clara leaned forward, eyes bright. "He never invites people to dinner, not even Mrs. Kincaid." "So, Nora smiled faintly. Then, I'll make sure not to spill anything. Hours passed more slowly than usual. Nora found herself standing longer than necessary before the mirror in her room, debating over the simple navy dress she had brought with her when she moved in. She finally decided on it, pairing it with a silver pendant that had belonged to her mother. The look was understated, but she wasn't here to impress anyone with glitter. When she entered the dining room, she felt the weight of the space immediately. The high ceilings, the heavy curtains drawn just enough to let in the warm glow of the chandeliers, the long polished table set with gleaming silverware. Clara sat halfway down, her chair positioned next to a regular dining chair. Ethan stood at the far end, speaking to Mrs. Kincaid in a low voice. He turned when he heard her steps. "Nora," he said simply, gesturing toward the seat opposite Clara. "Thank you for joining us." The formality in his tone didn't hide the fact that his eyes lingered a fraction longer than usual, as if noting the change in her appearance. Dinner began quietly. A first course of roasted squash soup was served, and Clara quickly began telling her father about the picture she had drawn earlier. She reached for the paper beside her and slid it across the table. Ethan unfolded it, his gaze catching on the bold lines and bright colors. The picture showed 3 figures, one tall man with dark hair, one woman with a soft smile, and a little girl in a wheelchair, all in the middle of a garden with scarves fluttering overhead. Above them, the sun shone wide and yellow. "It's us," Clara said proudly. "From the garden." Ethan studied the drawing for a moment longer than necessary. "It's very good," he said at last, his voice. "You're keeping it, right?" Clara asked. Ethan said, "I'll put it in my study." Nora watched him fold the paper with care and slip it into the inside pocket of his jacket. For a man who seemed to keep most of the world at arm's length, it was a surprisingly tender gesture. As the main course was served, grilled salmon with lemon butter and roasted vegetables, Ethan turned his attention to Nora. "Clara tells me you've been creative with her schedule." Nora met his gaze evenly. "I've been adapting it to what I see," she responds to. His mouth quirked slightly, though it was unclear if it was approval or mild disapproval. "You seem to have a talent for earning her trust." "It's not about talent," Nora replied, setting down her fork. "It's about listening." There was a pause, the kind that invited, or perhaps demanded, elaboration, but Ethan shifted his approach instead. "You worked in pediatric rehabilitation before this, didn't you?" Nora's hand stilled over her glass. "For a while." "Did you leave?" Her eyes dropped briefly to her plate before lifting again. "Personal reasons?" "True then." "That's vague," he said, though his tone lacked accusation. "That's intentional," she replied. For a moment, their gazes locked across the table, neither yielding. The air between them carried the tension of 2 people who both understood boundaries, and the stubbornness to hold them. Clara, oblivious to the undercurrent, began telling a story about how one of the scarves in the garden had gotten caught on a branch and how she'd worked to pull it down. Ethan listened to her, but his eyes returned to Nora more than once, as if trying to read what she wasn't saying. When dessert arrived, a small slice of apple tart for each of them, Clara insisted Nora take the first bite of hers. "It's the best part," she said with a grin. Nora smiled and obliged. "You were right." Dinner ended without further probing from Ethan, but the silence between his questions carried its own weight. As they rose from the table, Clara asked if Nora could read to her before bed. Ethan nodded, and the 3 of them left the dining room together, the formality of the evening giving way to something almost but not quite comfortable. Clara chose a book of short stories from her shelf, and Nora settled into the armchair beside the bed, while Clara nestled under the covers. The lamplight painted the room in warm amber, casting soft shadows on the walls. Nora read with an easy rhythm, occasionally glancing up to see Clara's eyes growing heavy. Midway through the second story, Clara's voice interrupted the quiet. The girl hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "Do you think I could walk someday?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Nora's eyes softened. She closed the book slowly, setting it on the table. "Thanks," she said gently. "You can surprise everyone." Clara's brow furrowed. Even Daddy? Especially Daddy, Nora replied with a faint smile. What Nora didn't know was that Ethan was standing just beyond the half-open door. He had come to check on Clara, intending to say goodnight, but had stopped when he heard the question. The words, "You can surprise everyone," struck something deep in him. Not hope, but fear. Fear of promises that might never be kept. Fear of the devastation in Clara's eyes if the world proved Nora wrong. His face hardened in the shadows. He stepped back quietly before either of them noticed him and made his way down the hallway toward his study. Inside, the room felt colder than it had earlier. He poured himself a glass of water and stood by the dark garden beyond. The image of Clara laughing among the scarves returned to him, but it was now joined by the memory of hospital rooms, of well-meaning doctors who had once spoken in careful tones about realistic expectations. Ethan had built his life and Clara's around those expectations. Safety meant limits. It meant never letting her believe she could reach beyond what was possible. But Nora Bennett, she didn't play by those rules. Upstairs, Clara was already drifting toward sleep, her breathing slow and even. Nora lingered a moment longer, watching the child's face relax. She brushed a strand of hair from Clara's forehead, then slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. She was halfway to her own room when she saw Ethan at the far end of the hall. Their eyes met briefly before he turned away, disappearing into his study without a word. In her room, Nora sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wind chime hanging in the window. The faint sound of its glass beads touching in the night air was a reminder of why she was here, and why she couldn't give up on Clara, no matter how many walls her father tried to keep around her. In his study, Ethan remained by the window for a long time, the glass in his hand untouched. He told himself he was only protecting Clara from disappointment. But somewhere deep down, he wondered if what he was really protecting was himself, from the possibility that Nora might be right. The morning was crisp, the kind of late spring day where the sun carried just enough warmth to make the garden inviting. Clara sat in her wheelchair near the center of the lawn, a bright red balloon bobbing at the end of a ribbon tied loosely around her wrist. Nora crouched beside her, inflating another balloon and tying it off. "Okay," she said, handing it to Clara. "This one is for the game." "A game?" Clara's eyes lit with curiosity. "It's called Keep It Up," Nora explained. "You tap the balloon into the air and try not to let it touch the ground. Simple, but it makes you stretch and reach without thinking about it." Clara grinned, holding her first balloon. "I can do that." Nora moved back a few steps. "Ready? Go." The balloon sailed up into the air, and Clara laughed as she reached for it, tapping it higher. Her arms moved more freely than Nora had seen in weeks, her upper body leaning forward to keep the balloon in play. A light breeze caught the balloon, pushing it to the side. Clara leaned toward it, stretching her arm to tap it again. "Got it," she said, the laughter bubbling in her voice. Nora clapped. "Nice save! Now two at once." She tossed the second balloon into the air. Clara's hands darted back and forth, tapping one, then the other, her cheeks flushed with the effort. They were so caught up in the game that neither noticed the figure standing near the stone arch at the edge of the lawn. Ethan Hawthorne watched silently, his jaw tight, eyes narrowing as Clara leaned further and further forward. The wind picked up again, sending the red balloon drifting just beyond Clara's reach. She shifted in her seat, leaning hard to the right, her hand stretching out. The wheelchair tilted slightly on the uneven grass. "Careful," Nora said sharply, stepping closer, but Clara was still focused on the balloon. She tapped it at the last moment, and the chair tipped just enough that one wheel lifted off the ground. Nora lunged, steadying the chair before it could go further. "Got you," she said quickly, her hands gripping the armrest. Clara was still smiling, oblivious to the shadow that fell over them. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Ethan's voice was low but seething, each word cutting through the sunlight like ice. Nora turned slowly, still keeping one hand on the wheelchair. "We were playing." His gaze dropped to Clara, then back to Nora. "She could have fallen." "She didn't fall," Nora said evenly. "I was right here." "That's not the point," Ethan snapped. You are encouraging her to lead and to push herself into positions that could hurt her. Do you have any idea? Nora cut in, her voice sharper than she intended. I have every idea, Ethan. I've spent years working with children like Clara. I know exactly how far she can go, and she needs to go further if she's ever going to believe in herself. Ethan's eyes darkened. Belief won't protect her from injury. Nora said, standing now, her pulse pounding. But your fear will keep her trapped exactly where she is. She is stronger than you let her be. Clara's eyes darted between them, her smile fading. Daddy? Inside, Ethan said to her, his voice firm. Now. Clara hesitated, but, with his repeated, without looking away from Nora. Nora's stomach twisted as Mrs. Kincaid appeared from the terrace, wheeling Clara toward the house. The girl's eyes were wide, her head turning back toward Nora even as the distance between them grew. When they were alone, the air between Nora and Ethan felt charged, the garden suddenly too quiet. You think I'm holding her back, Ethan said flatly. I know you are, Nora replied. Every time she tries something new, you step in with rules and warnings. You've built her a cage and told yourself it's a fortress. And that cage keeps her safe. Nora said, her voice trembling now. It keeps you safe, from the fear of losing her, from the fear of seeing her hurt. But what about her? What kind of life are you protecting if she never gets to test her own limits? For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the distant creak of the garden gate in the breeze. Finally, Ethan's voice dropped lower, colder. You're done here. Nora felt the words like a physical blow. You're firing me? Protecting my daughter. Her breath caught, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. You're making a mistake. Pack your things, he said, turning away. I want you gone by nightfall. Nora stood there for a moment after he left, the sunlight suddenly feeling harsher on her skin. She wanted to chase after him, to argue, to force him to see what she saw in Clara. The spark, the progress, the possibility. But she knew his walls were too high in this moment. She walked back into the house, the echo of her footsteps sounding foreign in the polished hallways. When she reached her room, she found Clara waiting in the doorway, her small hands gripping the wheels of her chair. Is it true? Clara's voice was barely a whisper. Nora knelt beside her. Your dad thinks it's best if I leave. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. But why? I didn't fall. You were right there. I was fine. No, Nora said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. But sometimes grown-ups get scared, even when they don't need to be. I don't want you to go. Nora swallowed hard. I don't want to go either. She reached for the girl's hand, squeezing it gently. But you have to keep playing, keep trying. Promise. Clara nodded quickly, her lip trembling. Promise. They stayed like that for a moment, until Mrs. Kincaid's shadow fell across the doorway. Clara, she said gently, your father is asking for you. Clara's eyes flooded again. No. Sweetheart, Nora murmured, it's okay. Go on. Reluctantly, Clara turned her chair and wheeled away, glancing back every few seconds until she disappeared around the corner. Packing felt like moving through water. Nora folded her few dresses and tops, tucked away the small collection of books she'd brought, and placed the wind chime carefully into her satchel. Every sound in the room, the rustle of fabric, the click of the suitcase clasp, seemed too loud, as though the house itself was listening. When she stepped into the hallway with her bag, she found Clara there again, this time without Mrs. Kincaid. The girl's face was blotchy from crying. I made you something, Clara said, holding out a folded piece of paper. Nora opened it to find a drawing, two stick figures holding hands in a garden filled with colorful scarves. Above them, in uneven letters, Clara had written, "Come back soon." Nora's throat tightened. She crouched down, hugging Clara carefully. I will, she whispered, no matter what. A sound behind them made her straighten. Ethan stood at the end of the hallway, his expression unreadable. Clara wheeled herself toward him, clutching the drawing against her chest. Daddy, please, she said, her voice breaking. Don't make her go. Ethan's jaw worked, but he didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to Nora, then back to Clara. Go to your room, he said quietly. Clara's hands tightened on the wheels. No. Clara. His tone hardened just slightly. Now. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she turned her chair and disappeared into her room, the door closing behind her. Nora adjusted the strap of her bag, meeting Ethan's gaze one last time. You think you're protecting her, she said quietly, but all you're doing is teaching her to be afraid. He didn't reply, his face a mask. With a final glance toward Clara's closed door, Nora walked down the hall, each step echoing in the vast silence of Hawthorne Manor. The front door closed behind her with a sound that seemed to carry through every marble corridor, leaving the house a little colder than before. The house felt different after Nora left. It wasn't something Ethan could put into words, but the absence was tangible. A hollow note in the air, the way silence clung a little heavier to the walls. Clara spoke less, retreated more. The scarves from the garden lay untouched on her dresser, their colors dulled without movement. 2 days after sending Nora away, Ethan was in his study late at night when Mrs. Kincaid appeared in the doorway. She was holding a sealed envelope. This was in Miss Bennett's room, she said quietly, addressed to Clara. Ethan took it without comment. He sat for a long moment after she left, turning the envelope over in his hands. The handwriting was neat but unpretentious, each letter carefully formed. He hesitated, knowing it wasn't meant for him, but something in the weight of the paper made him slide a finger under the flap. The letter began with a simple greeting. My dear Clara, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Not because of anything you did, but because sometimes grown-ups can't agree on the same way forward. I need you to know that you are brave. Braver than you think, stronger than you've been told. I've seen you lean forward, stretch further, laugh louder, and I believe, truly believe, there will come a day when you take steps in this garden without a chair beneath you. Ethan's hand stilled over the page. I've drawn it for you here, the letter continued, because sometimes pictures feel more real than words. He turned the page and found a small sketch in pencil. It showed Clara, older, hair a little longer, standing in the same garden where they had played with the scarfs. Her arms were raised in triumph, and the wheelchair sat empty behind her. Nora had drawn herself standing nearby, hands clasped, smiling. Even Ethan was in the picture, off to the side, watching, an expression of quiet awe on his face. Keep this picture. Keep it until the day it becomes true. And remember, surprising people isn't about proving them wrong. It's about showing them who you really are. With love and belief, Nora. Ethan set the letter down, pressing his fingers to his temple. The image of Clara and the drawing clung to him, more persistent than he wanted it to be. He could hear her laughter from that day in the garden, the way her cheeks had glowed with effort. He had told himself that sending Nora away was protecting his daughter. Now, staring at that letter, he wondered if all he'd done was dim the one light that had made Clara shine. He couldn't sleep. The next morning, instead of heading to his office, he called Mark, his assistant. I need everything you can find on Nora Bennett, Ethan said. Not the surface details, all of it. Mark didn't ask why. I'll start now. By midday, a file sat on Ethan's desk. He opened it, scanning the pages. Her professional history was laid out in clean lines. 6 years in pediatric rehabilitation, commendations from colleagues, notes about her patience and creativity. Then, abruptly, a resignation dated 11 months ago. It was the attached report that made him pause. Nora had been working with a boy named Michael Torres, 9 years old, who had suffered severe injuries in a car accident. Multiple surgeries, months of therapy. The report stated that his condition had been improving slowly, and then one night, complications from an internal injury had taken him. The hospital had cleared Nora of any fault. Still, Ethan could see it in the subtext. She had taken it personally. A witness statement from a colleague confirmed it. She blamed herself, even though no one else did. She said she should have seen it coming, should have done more. He leaned back in his chair, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. He knew what it was to carry guilt that wasn't yours, to replay moments until they became something heavier than the truth. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder what it must have cost her to walk into Hawthorne Manor, to work with Clara despite everything that had happened before. And he had thrown her out? He closed the file and picked up the phone. "Mark, find out where she is now." It took less than a day for Mark to return with an answer. "She's been volunteering at the Eastbrook Community Center 3 afternoons a week. Children's program. No salary, just time." Ethan stared at the note Mark had written. The address scrawled beneath. Eastbrook, he repeated quietly. It was a part of the city he rarely had reason to visit. Smaller streets, older buildings, a hum of life far removed from the manicured order of the manor. That afternoon, he drove there himself. The community center was a converted brick schoolhouse, its paint faded, the windows streaked but clean. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of crayons and floor polish. Children's voices echoed from down the hall. He followed the sound until he reached a wide room where tables were scattered with coloring books, puzzles, and blocks. A small group of children sat in a circle on the floor, passing a ball back and forth. In the center, guiding them with gentle words, was Nora. She wore jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair pulled into a loose braid. There was a lightness in her face he hadn't seen at the manor, an ease in her movements, in the way she laughed when one boy fumbled the ball and sent it rolling toward her. For a moment, Ethan just watched. It was strange, this feeling, not unlike the first time he had seen her in the conservatory with Clara. Only now there was no barrier of his own skepticism to dull it. Nora noticed him after a while, her expression shifting slightly but not breaking stride. She finished the game, then handed the ball to one of the volunteers before walking toward him. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice even. "This is a surprise. I read your letter to Clara," he admitted. Her eyes flickered, but she didn't look away. "It wasn't meant for you." "No. But I'm glad I did." He hesitated. "I also know why you left your career." Her shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. "And?" "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Sorry for throwing you out without listening. Sorry for not trusting you." She crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "You were protecting her." "I told myself that," he said quietly, "but maybe I was protecting myself. I didn't want her to hope for something I thought was impossible." "Hope isn't the enemy, Ethan," her voice softened. "It's the only thing that makes the impossible worth trying." He looked at her for a long moment, the noise of the children fading behind them. "Will you come back?" Nora's lips pressed together, her eyes searching his. "Not unless you're ready to let her try, really try, even if it scares you." "It already scares me," he said. "But I'd rather be scared and see her smile than keep her safe and watch her fade." A faint smile touched her mouth, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Then maybe we can talk." They stood there in the quiet space between past and possibility, neither moving just yet. Outside, the late afternoon light splanted through the high windows, spilling across the floor like the first step towards something neither of them could name, but both knew mattered. As it had been a week since their conversation at the Eastbrook Community Center. The air between Nora and Ethan had shifted, not entirely warm, but no longer sharp with distrust. She had returned to Hawthorne Manor quietly, without ceremony, carrying her single bag over her shoulder and the wind chime tucked safely inside. Clara's reaction had been anything but quiet. She'd wheeled herself at full speed across the conservatory floor, nearly colliding with the table in her haste to reach Nora. Her arms had wrapped tight around Nora's waist, and her voice had cracked when she said, "You came back?" Now, mornings felt different. There was a lightness in the halls, a thread of anticipation woven into the routine. Ethan kept his word, he did not interfere. He watched from a distance, sometimes not at all, as Nora wove her games and challenges into Clara's days. On the morning of the breakthrough, the garden was bathed in late spring sunlight. The air carried the scent of blooming wisteria and freshly cut grass, a rare combination in this part of the estate. Nora stood under the same tree where, weeks ago, she had tied scarves for Clara to read. But today was different. Today, she had a plan. A small wicker basket sat at her feet, filled with bright ribbons, crimson, sapphire, gold, emerald, each with a shiny token tied to the end. The ribbons were placed just far enough apart across the garden to form a winding path, each one a little higher or farther than the last. Clara wheeled out onto the lawn, shading her eyes with one hand. "What's this?" she asked, curiosity sparking. "It's a treasure hunt," Nora said. "Each ribbon has a prize. The rule is simple. You have to collect them in order, and you have to try to get them yourself." Clara laughed. "What if I can't reach? And you figure out how to—" Nora's tone was playful but purposeful. From the other side of the garden, behind a tall oak, Ethan stood, half dreaming. He told himself he was simply on his way to the stables, but his feet had stopped when he saw the setup. Now, he lingered, watching. The first ribbon hung low from a rosebush, easy to grasp. Clara plucked it with no trouble and examined the token, a small, carved wooden star. "Down," Nora said. "Next." The second ribbon was tied a little higher, fluttering in the breeze from a low-hanging branch. Clara rolled closer, stretched her arm, and caught it after 2 tries. This time, the token was a seashell, smooth and white. "You're good at this," Nora encouraged. The third ribbon was different. It dangled just beyond the reach of her seated position, forcing her to lean forward as far as she could. Clara bit her lip, struggling, her fingertips brushing the fabric but not quite catching it. "You're close," Nora said. "Try shifting in your seat a little." Clara adjusted her weight, leaning from the hips. The wheels creaked under the change in balance, but her hand closed around the ribbon at last. She held it up, beaming. Ethan's breath caught where he stood. He recognized the determination in his daughter's face, but there was something new there, a fire that had been missing for years. "Next one's over there," Nora said, pointing to a branch farther along the path. One was positioned so Clara could reach if she pushed her chair close enough and leaned, but Nora hesitated. She knelt beside Clara. "I think you can do more than just lean," she said gently. Clara frowned. "Like what?" "Like using your legs," Nora replied softly. "Just for a second, just enough to see how it feels. I'll be right here." Clara's eyes widened. "I've never—" "Nell," Nora said, "but I'll hold you. You won't fall." Behind the tree, Ethan's shoulders stiffened. His instinct was to step out, to say something, but he stayed rooted in place, almost against his will. Clara glanced at the ribbon, then at Nora. "Okay," she whispered. Nora locked the wheelchair's brakes and stood in front of her. She took Clara's hands. "When you're ready, push with your legs, just a little, and I'll help you stand." Clara took a shaky breath. Then, slowly, she pressed her feet into the grass. Her knees trembled, but with Nora's steady grip, she began to rise. Her eyes widened at the strange weight shift, the feel of the earth under her soles. "You're doing it," Nora murmured, her voice trembling with pride. "You're standing—" Clara's balance wavered, but Nora's hand stayed firm, guiding her upright. The ribbon was just ahead, swaying gently in the breeze. "Reach for it," Nora said, her voice low and steady. Clara's arm lifted, fingers brushing the fabric. She let out a small laugh, half disbelief, half exhilaration, and with one last push from her legs, she grabbed it. "I got it," she gasped, clutching the ribbon like it was a crown jewel. From behind the tree, Ethan's vision blurred. He blinked hard, but the image stayed. His daughter standing, not in a therapy room, not in a dream, but here, in the sunlight, on her own 2 feet. Nora eased her back into the chair, unlocking the brakes. Clara was breathless, cheeks flushed, eyes alight. "I didn't think I could," she said. "You can," Nora replied, "and you just did." They moved on to the next ribbon, and this time, Clara didn't hesitate when Nora suggested standing again. Her legs were unsteady, her muscles protesting, but each success brought a brighter smile. By the 5th ribbon, she was standing a little longer, leaning less on Nora's hands. Ethan stayed hidden, afraid that if he stepped into view, the fragile magic of the moment might shatter. His throat was tight, his chest heavy, but he couldn't look away. The final ribbon was tied high in the low branches of the tree, where it had all begun, weeks ago. The sunlight caught its golden fabric, making it glow. "This is the last one," Nora said, "but it's going to take everything you've got." Clara nodded, determination etched into her face. She positioned herself, hands gripping Nora's. With a slow, deliberate push, she rose to her feet. "Good," Nora encouraged. "Now, one step." Clara's eyes widened. "A step?" Nora said gently, "Just one, toward the ribbon." Clara looked at the fabric, then at her own feet. Her knees wobbled as she shifted her weight. Then, with a tiny forward movement, she brought her right foot ahead. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't fast, but it was a step. The sound that escaped her was part laugh, part sob. She took another, and Nora's breath caught. By the time Clara's hand closed around the golden ribbon, Ethan's face was wet. He didn't remember the last time he had cried like this. Clara held the ribbon high, grinning so wide it lit her entire face. "I did it!" she shouted. "You did," Nora said, her voice thick. Ethan stepped back from the tree, swallowing hard. He needed a moment before they saw him, needed to gather himself, to understand how, in one afternoon, everything he thought was impossible had shifted. Nora knelt in front of Clara, tying the golden ribbon to the arm of the chair like a medal. "This is proof," she said, "that you can surprise everyone." Clara's smile faltered only for a second. "Even Daddy?" Nora glanced toward the trees. "Especially Daddy." What neither of them knew was that, just beyond the leaves, Ethan was already thinking of how to make sure this day, this step was only the beginning. 1 year later, morning light softened Hawthorne Manor until the stone looked almost warm. The garden was trimmed and welcoming, the old paths clear, the roses trained into bright arches. A wind chime whispered at the kitchen window, while Mrs. Kincaid stacked pale yellow programs and pretended not to beam whenever Clara rolled past to check the ribbon at her waist. The gold ribbon was there, its silk a promise. "Is it crooked?" Clara asked, twisting in her chair. "Perfect," Nora said, smoothing the dress and the air around them. "And so are you." Ethel paused in the doorway, with his jacket over one arm and his tie in the other. The year had changed him in details that added up to something larger. Easier shoulders, a quieter jaw, eyes that chose wonder faster than worry. He set the jacket aside and bent to Clara's level. "Last inspection," he said. "Stand tall for me." Clara set the brakes and rose with practiced care, knees steady, feet planted. Ethan's breath hitched. He handed Nora the tie. "Will you?" She looped the tie, tightened the knot, and settled it against his collar. The closeness held for a heartbeat. Then Mrs. Kincaid arrived with the programs and a crisp announcement that the cars were ready. Straight outside, the old brick school breathed like a festival. Banners in white and green draped the facade. Clara Hawthorne Center for Pediatric Rehabilitation. Parents, therapists, neighbors, and donors filled the steps. Mark worked a clipboard at the press with the same patient cadence, toward doors, parking, and coffee. Inside, lemon oil and new wood-scented rooms arranged for courage. Mats and bars, shelves of bright tools, a quiet room with paper stars on the ceiling. In the lobby, a bronze plaque waited under a cloth. Below the center's name were 2 lines, Director Ethan Hawthorne, Co-Director Nora Bennett, and a dedication in smaller type. For every child who was told. Nora touched the edge of the cloth and let her hand fall. She had asked for privacy when the words were first proposed. Ethan had refused, gently and completely. Today, she was glad he had. Clara tugged Nora's sleeve. "Do I get to see it first?" "Only if we count down together," Nora said. The auditorium filled. Ethan turned his speech cards, then slid them away. Families settled babies on shoulders, siblings with crayons, mothers with bags of snacks and hope. The 3 of them waited in the wings, hands linked like a single decision. The mayor kept it short. A donor spoke about community and return on generosity. A therapist explained why play is a science. A music teacher rang small bells and made the room smile. When Ethan stepped to the podium, the air changed. "Good morning," he said, "and let the words belong to everyone. I spent years believing safety was the same as living. My daughter taught me the difference. Nora reminded me how to listen." He did not promise miracles, he promised invitations. He promised the word yet would follow can't. He nodded to Mark. Nora joined him at the plaque. Together they pulled the cloth free. Gasps softened into applause. Nora's fingers found Ethan's for one steadying squeeze before she turned to Clara. "Ready?" "I'm gonna go slow so everyone can see," Clara said, mischief bright in her voice. Ethan lifted the microphone. "Our final speaker prefers brevity. Please welcome Clara Hawthorne." He offered his hand. Nora offered the other. They walked from the wings. 10 steps, then 2 more for joy. The gold ribbon at Clara's waist caught the light like a small flag. "Hi," she said into the mic that had been lowered to her height. "I used to think the garden was too big. I was wrong. I just needed someone to show me where to put my feet. Nora did that. Daddy kept standing there even when he was scared." Soft laughter and softer tears met the truth. "I want this place to be like that. I want ribbons everywhere." Applause rose and settled. A volunteer rolled the chair forward. Clara sat. The 3 of them stayed a breath longer than the program required, because victory deserves a pause. The ribbon was cut, photos were taken, and the building opened like a book. Children explored, therapists knelt and listened. The art teacher unfurled paper across a floor and invited footprints and wheel tracks in washable paint. Near the back, a boy with braces tried the parallel bars while his mother laughed and cried at the same time. Nora moved through it all with sleeves pushed up and eyes tuned to posture and possibility. Ethan signed forms, shook hands, and learned names he wanted to remember. He watched Nora devour logistics and small kindnesses at once. A loose wheel tightened, a shy child invited by a game, a worried father given a sentence he could carry home. He watched Clara invent a beanbag game that made effort look like play. By afternoon, the hum softened. Mark forced Ethan to drink water. Mrs. Kincaid stood at the plaque and dabbed her eyes with a linen handkerchief she swore was dust. A grandmother whispered thank you and touched the bronze like a prayer. They stepped into sunlight that felt like permission. "Home?" Nora asked. "Home," Ethan said, and the word fit. Clara slept in the car with the ribbon wrapped around her fingers. Ethan drove with the window cracked and the radio off, collecting the day in his chest, the way careful people collect proof. Back at the manor, they did not scatter. They drifted to the garden. The tree remembered ribbons even without wearing them. Nora spread a blanket. Ethan carried lemonade, strawberries, and the last wedge of apple tart saved for sentences that needed a sweet period. Clara woke to leaves and sky. "Did I do okay?" "You were luminous," Nora said. "You were brave," Ethan added. "And funny," Clara decided, then declared that being funny and brave at the same time was difficult but doable. She reached for the camera. "We need a picture." Ethan set the timer. Nora helped Clara rise. They held the gold ribbon between their hands, as if they were lifting a small banner for anyone who needed to see it. Ethan stepped close, an arm around both, his cheek near Clara's hair. The shutter clicked. The moment went in. Before they left the center, a reporter with a cautious smile asked Ethan what success would look like a year from now. He answered without looking at notes. "Success," he said, "would be laughter in rooms that used to echo. It would be a child sleeping from honest effort, a parent who drove home with a lighter grip on the wheel, a teenager who discovered balance while reaching for something that looked like a toy." He said numbers would matter and stories would matter more. Another question landed in Nora's lap. Why put Michael's name on the wall? She did not offer the whole story. She said, "There are children who teach you after they are gone," and that the center wanted to keep listening. The reporter lowered her mic and squeezed Nora's elbow in a gesture that was not for the camera. In a quiet hallway, Ethan and Nora found 30 seconds without anyone else. He thanked her for the way she had carried the morning. She thanked him for the way he had shared it. He started to say something heavier and stopped. She started to say it for him and stopped too. The truth did not need to be forced. It would arrive in its own stride, the way Clara's steps had. On the ride home, Nora scrolled through the first photos that Mark had already texted. In one, Ethan was at the edge of the frame, not posing, watching Clara with a look that made the room seem softer. She saved it. She planned to print it. They brought the camera inside while the light changed from gold to blue, and the house settled into an evening hum. Mrs. Kincaid had set 3 plates at the kitchen table, as if the habit had been there for years. She insisted they eat before looking at any photographs. This command lasted exactly 2 bites. Clara begged. Ethan surrendered first. Nora had already folded. They scrolled through the images on the screen. The best ones were not the posed pictures on the stage, but the half moments. Clara waving at a toddler, Nora at the plaque with her shoulders eased, Ethan crouched to tie a shoe that was not his child's. There was a grainy shot of the 3 of them in the garden that the camera had somehow made beautiful. Nora tapped it and felt something settle in her chest. "One," she said. "This one should be framed." "Whitney needs words," Clara said. "Pictures need words so people know what they're looking at." Mrs. Kincaid brought out a wooden frame from a cupboard she guarded like a vault. She set it on the table with a pen she kept for letters that mattered. "Then write the words," she said. "Do it properly." The pen trembled in Clara's hand, not with weakness, but with the weight of ceremony. She looked at Nora, she looked at Ethan. She studied the image where the gold ribbon lay between their joined hands. Then she printed the sentence, in careful lines on a plain white card. "First steps are taken together." She held it up without comment. Ethan closed his eyes for a second. Nora pressed her lips together and nodded. Mrs. Kincaid turned away, muttering that onions were untrustworthy. "Where should it go?" Clara asked as the frame clicked shut. "Your room," Ethan said, then paused. "The hallway outside your room." Nora shook her head gently. "The garden room," she suggested, "where the light changes and everyone sees it." They walked there slowly, not because anyone needed to, but because it felt right. The garden room held the high windows and the first wind chime. The evening breeze carried the faintest notes across the marble. Ethan found the hook himself and climbed the small step stool that Mrs. Kincaid allowed only when supervised. He centered the frame. Nora straightened it with 2 fingers. Clara stood between them, steady as a small pillar. They did not speak for a minute. Sometimes silence is the loudest gratitude a house can hold. Ethan opened his. Inside was a card from the mother of the boy who had tried the bars near the back. She had written only 3 lines. "He slept through the afternoon. He did not cry during toothbrushing. We both believe more tonight than we did this morning." Ethan stood, very still, and let the card do what it came to do. Nora's envelope held something heavier than paper. A small seashell on blue string, taped to a note in a child's slanted letters. "Thank you for making games. Thank you for saying yet. When I shake this shell, it sounds like yes." Nora curled her hand around the shell like a vow. Clara's bedtime came, not as a rule, but as a yawn she could not fight. Nora carried her upstairs, even though Clara insisted she could make it herself. At the threshold, Clara asked for the long story, the one with the princess who learns to fly when no one is watching. Nora told it soft and slow, adjusting the plot with tiny edits that matched the day they had lived. When the story ended, Clara did not let go of Nora's hand. "Will it always feel like this?" she asked. "Always," Nora answered, honest by habit. "But often, and on the days it doesn't, we will make the feeling again." "Promise? Promise?" Ethan stood in the hall during the last lines and waited until he heard the light change in the room, the way it always did when Clara drifted towards sleep. He stepped in to kiss her forehead. She caught his wrist with a drowsy grip and tugged him closer so she could whisper a private plan for next week's treasure hunt. He agreed to every rule she invented. Upstairs, the garden room held its new center. The frame drew Ethan and Nora back like gravity. They stood in front of it, as people do when a picture teaches them what their own faces look like. "Thank you for coming back," Ethan said. It was not the first time he had said it, but tonight it sounded like the first time he had said it to himself. "Thank you for letting me," Nora said, and then, after a pause, "and for the plaque." "I thought about Michael when Clara spoke," he admitted, "about the children who teach us after they're gone." "He would have loved the music teacher," Nora said. "He loved noise that sounded like light." They stood closer than the length of a sentence. The wind pressed the chime against the frame, a tiny tap like a conductor's cue. "Squeaky can add programs as we learn," Ethan said, shifting to the language he trusted when feelings ran bright. "Saturday free play. parent workshops, an open garden hour. Storytelling circle, Nora added. Movement through make-believe. The annual treasure hunt, he said, and laughed at himself. With prizes no one outgrows. They planned until the plans felt like rest. They planned until they were only two people in a room, learning how to say us without wobbling. He reached for her hand because he knew he could. She let him because it was already true. They went back to the garden. Night had emptied it of edges. Fireflies blinked near the hedges as if someone had strung tiny lamps just for show. The trees stood like a memory made of wood. Nora took the basket of scarves from a shelf beside the door and handed it to Ethan. "We should put one out," she said, "for tradition." He chose the blue scarf. Together they tied it low, not as a challenge, but as a reminder. They sat on the blanket and did nothing that could be measured. Every so often, the scarf lifted like a slow exhale. He told her how he had read the letter again the night he found it, the one she wrote to Clara about running in the garden. She told him she had dreamed of this room without dreaming it would be possible. He told her that fear had not left him, but had learned to stand beside hope instead of in front of it. She told him hope liked the arrangement. They said very small things that were really large things, and then they did not speak at all. The house listened. The garden listened. The wind chime kept time. When they finally went in, the frame held steady. The inscription was simple enough to survive long days and hard ones. First steps are taken together. The picture caught a ribbon of sunlight that had not yet decided to be night and threaded it through their joined hands. On the anniversary of the center's opening, they hosted a small gathering. Not everyone could come, and that was fine. Enough did. The garden revolved again. Children wove in and out of the hedges. Ethan grilled with mixed success. Nora ran interference with the smoke detector. Clara officiated races that included stopping to listen to birds. When the sun eased down the trees, Ethan tapped a glass and asked for 1 minute. He did not speak about money or timelines. He spoke about the hallway frame. He described the sentence Clara had written and said he was still learning what it meant. He said family could be chosen, and that choosing was not a single decision, but 1,000 small repetitions of yes. Nora listened and heard the line beneath the lines. Clara listened and shouted that the yes of the day was cake. They ate cake. After everyone left, the three of them cleaned slowly. They carried empty cups, folded blankets, and collected a confetti of tiny ribbons from the grass. The garden returned to itself. The air cooled, the house glowed. At the foot of the stairs, Clara paused. "Can we check the frame?" They went to the garden room. The picture held steady, as if it had decided to be permanent. The sentence looked new again in the nightlight. Clara tapped the glass with one knuckle, the way people knock on wood for luck. "Good night," she told the picture. "Good ribbon." Ethan turned to Nora. There was no speech left in him, only a look with the weight of a promise and the ease of a homecoming. She returned it without effort. They stood a last time before the frame. A wind moved through the open window. The chime gave a single bright note and then went quiet, as if the house had heard what it needed. They switched off the light together and took the first step up the stairs side by side, leaving the picture to guard the room and the sentence to do its soft work, reminding anyone who passed that morning would keep arriving, that paths could be made where none had been, that a family can be built not by chance but by choice. The night folded around them like a gentle promise, and the new frame seemed to glow as if the house itself had decided to remember it.